In Pierre Part, Louisiana, King of the Swamp Troy Landry is on his way to meet a swamp elder who has a mystery to share. Over in Pierre Part, with his season and his career hunting gators at stake,
most fans saw Troy Landry as unshakable, a living Louisiana legend who wrestled with death every season and laughed in its face. But what they never saw was the quiet collapse happening behind the scenes. While millions cheered him on as the king of the swamp, Troy was fighting a battle far more dangerous than any gator he ever faced. His body began to betray him. His strength started slipping away, and the life he built, one of pride, grit, and survival, began to crack under the weight of time. The truth is, no one expected the downfall that followed. And now, looking back, the warning signs were there all along. How did a man who seemed unstoppable suddenly become the center of one of the most heartbreaking stories in reality television?
Famed gator hunter Troy Landry of the show Swamp People has found himself in a little bit of hot water.
The man who never backed down. Troy Landry grew up in the swamps long before the cameras showed up, long before fans turned him into a myth. This was a world where survival wasn't entertainment, it was instinct. From childhood, Troy was taught that hesitation meant hunger and fear meant failure. He learned to read the water like a language, to sense danger before it surfaced, to fight for every inch of life in the marsh. It was a lifestyle built on grit, passed down through generations. When Swamp People premiered, America fell in love with him instantly. He wasn't polished like other TV personalities. He wasn't scripted. He wasn't trying to be anything. He was the Bayou, raw, fearless, honest. Every shout of "Shoot 'em" echoed with the spirit of a man who had survived things most people never imagined. But the show gave fans only a glimpse of who Troy really was. In reality, he carried responsibilities that few understood: feeding a family, preserving a dying culture, and proving year after year that he still had what it took to command the swamp. And yet, behind the bravado was a secret that only grew heavier with time. The human body, no matter how tough, has limits. And for Troy, those limits were coming fast. Something had begun to change, and Troy could feel it deep in his bones. But instead of slowing down, he pushed harder. Why? What was he afraid the world might discover if he ever stopped moving? The hidden toll of fame. In the early seasons, fame felt like a blessing. Troy was recognized everywhere he went. Children begged for photos. Fans treated him like a hero. But as the years passed, the attention became a cage he couldn't escape. Producers expected him to be the fearless Swamp King every single day, even on the mornings he woke up aching and exhausted, struggling just to get out of bed. People didn't want to see Troy Landry age. They didn't want to see him weaken. They didn't want to see him break. They wanted the myth, not the man. The pressure grew slowly, almost invisibly. Each season demanded more dramatic hunts, more extreme conditions, more risks. And Troy, being who he was, refused to disappoint anyone, even when pain shot through his legs, even when he felt winded climbing into the boat, even when he finally admitted to himself that his health was beginning to fail. But instead of stepping back, he hit it. He smiled for the cameras. He pulled the trigger. He kept the legend alive. Because he knew the truth that his fans did not. The swamp takes its price, and eventually it comes to collect. What was happening to Troy's body, the thing he had relied on all his life, that he refused to let the world see? The health crisis that changed everything. Troy Landry's downfall didn't begin with a dramatic moment on camera. It started quietly, almost invisibly, with small aches he brushed off and fatigue he blamed on long days in the swamp. But over time, those aches grew sharper. The exhaustion became heavier. What should have been a routine season of alligator hunting slowly turned into a daily battle with his own body. At first, Troy refused to acknowledge it. Men like him don't complain. Not in the swamp. Not in life. Pain was something you pushed through. But soon, his family began to notice the decline. The way he moved slower climbing into the boat. The way he winced when he thought no one was looking. The way he rested just a little too long between hunts. His sons, Jacob and Chase, urged him to get checked out, but Troy always gave the same answer. The swamp doesn't wait. He kept going until he couldn't anymore. Behind the scenes, Troy received news that shook him and his family to their core. Doctors discovered a serious health issue, one that demanded immediate surgery and a long recovery. For the first time in his life, Troy was forced to face something he could not overpower with grit or experience. And that terrified him. This was not a gator he could wrestle or a storm he could outmaneuver. This was his own body failing him after decades of hard labor, long days, and sleepless nights. News of his condition never became a headline. Troy didn't want pity, and he didn't want to appear weak. But privately, he struggled with the reality that the life he built, one defined by strength and independence, might never be the same again. As the cameras rolled on the new season, Troy had a choice: step away and protect his health, or push forward and try to keep the legend alive. What he chose next would leave fans stunned, and it would shape the rest of his journey. But even as his body weakened, a much darker battle was taking shape behind the scenes. What was the other hidden crisis Troy was fighting that no one outside his closest circle knew about? The emotional collapse. No one expected. While Troy's physical health was deteriorating, a deeper struggle was unfolding, one that attacked his spirit far more than his body ever could. For decades, the swamp was his sanctuary, his identity, the place where he felt strong, capable, and completely himself. But during his recovery, he was forced away from it. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and for a man like Troy, nothing was more devastating than stillness. Suddenly, he wasn't the one steering the boat. He wasn't the one shouting commands. He wasn't the center of the hunt. Instead, he watched from the sidelines as younger men took over the responsibilities he once carried effortlessly. His sons tried to reassure him, but deep down, Troy feared something he never thought possible: that he was becoming replaceable. The isolation hit him harder than anyone realized. Away from the swamp, away from the adrenaline, away from the purpose that had driven him all his life, Troy felt a kind of emptiness he couldn't describe. Fans saw him as the fearless gator hunter, but in private, he questioned everything. Was this the beginning of the end? Would the world forget him once he stepped away? Who was Troy Landry if he wasn't the king of the swamp? His identity, once unshakable, now felt fragile. And with every passing day, the weight of that uncertainty grew heavier. Even when he eventually returned to the show, something was different. His body was slower. His recovery was ongoing. And the fear of losing everything he built, never left him. But as Troy fought the emotional toll, a new threat loomed on the horizon, one that would place his family, his legacy, and even his safety at risk. What new crisis blindsided him just as he thought he was finally getting his strength back? The family rift that tore Troy apart. While Troy Landry fought to reclaim his strength, another conflict was quietly building, one that hit even closer to home than his health battle. For years, the Landry family operated like a well-oiled machine. Everyone knew their role. Everyone respected the hierarchy. And above all else, Troy was the pillar holding everything together. But during his absence, subtle shifts began to grow into bigger divides. His sons had stepped up because they had to. They made decisions without him, handled hunts without him, and shouldered responsibilities he once took on alone. It was necessary, yes, but when Troy returned, he found a family dynamic that had changed in ways he wasn't prepared for. Suddenly, his voice didn't carry the same unquestioned authority. His opinions, once instantly accepted, were now discussed, debated, sometimes even challenged. It wasn't disrespect, it was independence. But for a man who had spent his entire adult life leading from the front, it felt like losing ground in his own household. And it only worsened when production began focusing more on his sons. Jacob and Chase had grown into strong personalities with their own storylines, something producers loved and audiences embraced. But to Troy, already struggling with his health and identity, this shift felt like a painful reminder. Time was moving on, whether he liked it or not. At one point, a small disagreement during filming, barely noticeable to viewers, turned into a heated argument off-camera. It wasn't about the disagreement itself, it was about everything building beneath the surface. Troy felt sidelined. His sons felt pressured to prove themselves, and the show unintentionally became the spark in a family conflict that had been simmering for months. Late one night, Troy sat alone on his porch, watching the swamp's dark waters ripple under the moonlight. For the first time, he wondered if the show that had brought his family fame, opportunity, and money was now the very thing pulling them apart. Could the Landry family survive the pressures of fame, aging, and generational change? Or was this the beginning of a split that would alter the family forever? The scandal producers tried to hide. As tensions rose within Troy's personal life, another storm was brewing, one involving the show itself. The world of reality television is rarely as simple as it appears, and Swamp People was no exception. Behind the scenes, whispers began circulating about production disputes, unfair contract changes, and the pressure placed on certain cast members to play exaggerated versions of themselves. For Troy, authenticity wasn't optional. He wasn't an actor, and he refused to pretend to be one. But producers pushed for bigger drama, higher intensity, and more conflict, things that didn't always align with what really happened on the swamp. Troy clashed with them repeatedly, insisting the show should tell the truth, not a scripted spectacle. Things became even more complicated when an incident occurred involving another cast member, one the network reportedly tried to keep quiet. This incident, whether fans knew it or not, deeply affected the entire crew. Production schedules were delayed, crew members were shuffled, and tension lingered like a fog over the bayou. Troy, already dealing with his health and family issues, found himself caught in the center of discussions he never wanted to be part of. Contracts were renegotiated, safety guidelines were questioned, and worst of all, a rumor began spreading online claiming Troy himself was leaving the show due to a major fallout with producers. That rumor wasn't true, but the friction behind it was. The truth was that Troy was tired of being pushed physically, emotionally, and contractually. Tired of feeling like the show was slipping further away from the quiet, rugged authenticity that made it special in the first place. And tired of watching the swamp, the place he loved, being turned into a stage. One day on set, after a particularly stressful dispute over a stage scene, Troy walked off and refused to film. That moment, which fans never saw, sent shockwaves through production. If Troy Landry left, Swamp People would lose its heart. But instead of supporting him, the network worried about ratings. So Troy faced a decision that could change everything. Should he continue with a show that no longer aligned with who he was, or walk away and risk losing the identity he fought his entire life to build? As he weighed that choice, an entirely new tragedy was quietly approaching, one that would make every other hardship fade in comparison. What devastating event struck just when Troy thought things couldn't get any worse? The decline he never saw coming. For most of his career, Troy Landry felt untouchable. He had survived storms, floods, hurricanes, injuries, financial scares, everything the swamp could throw at him. But nothing prepared him for the moment his body finally began to rebel. It started subtly, almost quietly, in a way that even the people closest to him barely noticed. He would pause more often to catch his breath. He would grip his side after a long day, just long enough for his sons to exchange uncertain glances. And for the first time in decades, the alligator season didn't start with Troy charging out of bed before sunrise, but with him sitting silently at the edge of the mattress, staring at the floor as though gathering enough willpower to stand up. The decline wasn't dramatic, and that made it somehow more frightening. It was slow, creeping, inevitable. Troy felt it in his bones, literally. The strength that carried him through years of heavy lifting, wrestling gators, hauling lines, and navigating unforgiving marshland was fading. He tried to hide it, but in the swamp, nothing stays hidden for long. And the worst part? The cameras caught everything. The producers of Swamp People had always admired Troy's toughness, but now they saw something different in him: vulnerability. They never exploited it, but even Troy noticed how often they began filming him from a distance, as though afraid to show just how fragile he was becoming. This wasn't just aging. This was something deeper, something he didn't want to admit. Was this the moment the king of the swamp realized his reign was slipping away? The day the swamp stood still. Troy Landry had always said the swamp talks. It tells you when to move, when to stay still, when danger is coming. But on the day everything changed, the swamp was silent. Unnaturally silent. Troy knew something was wrong long before anyone else did. His wife had called the boys early that morning. Her voice was calm, but the kind of calm that hides fear beneath every syllable. She said Troy wasn't waking up the way he usually did. She said he looked pale, drained, confused. When the boys arrived, they found their father slumped in his favorite chair, hands trembling, unable to lift himself to his feet. At first, they assumed it was exhaustion, a bad night, maybe dehydration. But then Troy tried to speak, and the words didn't form. His jaws moved, but his voice didn't come out the way it was supposed to. The sound was slurred, shapeless, wrong. It only took a few seconds for panic to settle in. The ambulance cut through the swamp roads like a knife. The family followed close behind, barely able to keep their vehicles steady on the winding dirt paths. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew it wasn't good. When the doctors came rushing in, Troy looked terrified. He wasn't afraid of gators, hurricanes, or the unknown depths of the bayou. But this betrayal from his own body, was something he could not fight with a knife or a line. He was powerless. As the family waited for the doctor's verdict, a single question hung heavy in the air. Would Troy Landry ever return to the swamp again? A fight he couldn't outrun. The hospital room felt nothing like the swamp Troy called home. It was too bright, too sterile, too quiet. There were no rustling trees, no frogs calling in the distance, no soft slap of water against the dock. Only the rhythmic beeping of machines and the low murmur of nurses moving quickly around him. For a man who spent his life in the wild, surrounded by living, breathing nature, the silence of the hospital was suffocating. Troy lay in the bed, his body connected to wires and tubes he never imagined he would need. Every attempt to sit up felt like lifting a mountain. Every breath came with effort. His sons stood beside him, their expressions tight and terrified, trying to hide emotions they had never shown before. They were grown men, tough men, raised by one of the strongest figures in the bayou. But seeing their father like this cracked them open in ways they didn't expect. The doctors ran their tests, spoke in hushed conversations, and returned with news that made the room feel even smaller. Troy's health, had been deteriorating far longer than he knew. The stress, the physical demands of swamp life, the decades of pushing himself past exhaustion, and the untreated issues he brushed off as just getting older had all accumulated into something more serious than any gator he ever faced. And for the first time, Troy confronted a terrifying realization. He wasn't invincible. He had built a life on resilience, the belief that he could weather anything. But this was a battle he could not track, hunt, or overpower. This was something happening inside him, and no amount of strength or grit could make it go away. When the doctors told him he needed long-term treatment and immediate lifestyle changes, Troy's face fell. Not because he feared the medical process, but because he feared losing the life he loved. The swamp was his identity, his legacy, his purpose. Without it, who was he? The boys saw that fear. It shook them. Troy Landry was the man who always had the answers, the plan, the instinct for every situation. But now he looked at them with uncertainty, a silent plea in his eyes that he never voiced out loud. The family stepped out into the hallway, their voices low and trembling. They weren't ready to imagine a future where Troy couldn't return to the swamp. They weren't ready to imagine a season without their father leading the boat, yelling across the bayou, calling the shots like he had for decades. But the question lingered heavily between them. What if this was the fight Troy didn't win? The legacy he feared losing. Recovery was slow, painfully slow. Troy wasn't used to sitting still, and now it felt like stillness was all he had. Days blurred into weeks as he worked through treatments, physical therapy, and long rest periods that made him restless and frustrated. The swamp he once commanded now felt distant, like a world he could see in his mind but no longer touch. And yet, while Troy's body struggled, his mind drifted constantly toward one overwhelming fear. How much time did he truly have left in the place he loved most? The show Swamp People had changed everything for him. It brought fame, money, recognition. But none of that meant anything without the land that shaped him. Troy wasn't a celebrity chasing spotlight. He was a man from the bayou who had simply let the world watch him work. And now he worried that the cameras had captured the peak of his life, and the rest would be spent fading quietly in the background. He began reflecting on something he had never talked about before: legacy. What he would leave behind. What would remain after he was gone. He thought of the generations of Landrys that came before him, men who lived and died in the swamp, their stories carried only by word of mouth. Troy was different. His life had been documented, broadcast, and preserved in a way they never imagined possible. But legacy wasn't fame. Legacy was impact. And he wondered whether he had done enough to prepare his boys, his grandkids, and even his fans for a world where he might not always be there to lead. Some nights, he lay awake replaying memories. The first gator he caught with his own father. The early mornings on the boat with Jacob and Chase. The laughter. The storms they survived together. These moments carved him into who he was. But what haunted him wasn't the past. It was the question of what came next. Would the Landry name survive without him steering the helm? Would the family continue the traditions that kept them bound to the swamp? Would the fans, millions of them, remember him as more than just a TV star? These thoughts weighed heavily on him, shaping his recovery in ways the doctors never saw. His body needed healing, but so did his spirit. And every time he closed his eyes, the same fear returned. What if he never made it back to the swamp that built his entire life? The return that almost didn't happen. When Troy finally stepped outside again without assistance, the Louisiana air felt different. He had breathed this air every day of his life, thick with humidity and the scent of bayou moss, but now it carried meaning, like it belonged to him again. The sunlight hit his face, and for a moment he just stood there, eyes closed, letting the warmth soak into the parts of him that had been cold for far too long. It was a simple moment, one most people would overlook. But to Troy, it felt like a rebirth. But recovery hadn't restored everything. He moved slower, felt weaker, and even small tasks reminded him that the man who once outworked everyone on the boat was now fighting just to keep up. The swamp he knew like the back of his hand had changed too. Water levels were different. Vegetation had shifted. Even the gators seemed more unpredictable than he remembered. The world had moved on while he was healing, and now he had to find his place in it again. His sons noticed his hesitation, the small pauses before he stepped into the boat, the way he gripped the railing a little too tightly, the flicker of doubt that crossed his face when no one else thought he was looking. Troy had always been the anchor in their family, the one who steadied everyone else. But now the roles were reversed. Jacob and Chase stood on either side of him, not because he asked, but because they knew he needed them in a way he never had before. Yet, despite the challenges, something powerful pushed Troy forward. It wasn't fame, or the cameras, or even the pressure to return to the show. It was the swamp itself, the land that shaped him, raised him, and held every memory of the people he loved. This place was his identity, and walking away from it permanently would have been a kind of death he wasn't ready to accept. Still, there were moments during that first trip back where he questioned everything. His arm trembled when he threw a line. His foot slipped slightly when he shifted his weight. And at one point, while scanning the water for movement, he realized he wasn't just fighting nature. He was fighting his own body, his own limitations, his own fear. But then something happened. As the sun rose over the bayou, a massive gator surfaced, its eyes locked onto the boat, the way countless others had throughout Troy's life. And in that moment, something deep inside him awakened. Instinct, memory, and purpose all tied together. He didn't feel weak. He didn't feel old. He felt like Troy Landry again. His boys watched the transformation with awe. The hesitation vanished. His voice steadied, his posture straightened, and for the first time since the hospital, the man who once carried the swamp on his shoulders stood tall again. That day didn't erase his struggles. It didn't heal everything or promise that the road ahead would be easy, but it proved something far more important. Troy wasn't done. His story wasn't finished, and his legacy wasn't fading. It was evolving. And as he guided the boat back to shore later that afternoon, feeling the familiar rhythm of the swamp beneath him, one thought echoed louder than any fear. He still belonged here. And maybe the swamp still needed him too. Troy Landry's journey has never been simple. It's been raw, unpredictable, and shaped by forces bigger than any one man. But through every hardship, the health scares, the emotional battles, the doubts that nearly broke him, he kept fighting, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he didn't know any other way to live. The swamp raised him, the show immortalized him, but it's his resilience that defines him. Today, as Troy continues to navigate this new chapter of his life, one truth stands above everything else. The man who captured the world's heart with his grit and honesty is still standing. He's still pushing forward. He's still refusing to give up, even when life tried harder than ever to stop him. And maybe that's why his story matters so much. It reminds us that strength isn't the absence of struggle. It's the decision to rise again every time the world knocks you down. If Troy's journey moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes to the battles people fight behind the scenes, make sure to let us know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the untold stories behind the people you thought you knew, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us next time. Because sometimes, the truth is far more powerful than the legend.